In this video, you will see examples of binding system applications. Here we have a simple UI with sliders, buttons, and labels. Dragging the sliders does nothing right now. On the other hand, when I click this button, cubes are being created and dropped off over this weight platform. You can see its output value reacting to weight changes. And here we have two doors reacting both to physics and its target opening value. The scripts for doors and platform are completely self-contained and independent from each other. This means they can potentially be linked to any external value. For example, the door can get its target opening value from a UI slider, a mouse wheel, a force, or the weight platform's output can become the door's input. Now let's try and bind some of the objects ourselves, but before we start, we need to better understand the binding data pipeline. Here is our complete data pipeline field. To get the idea of how data is traveling, we will go part by part and understand their purpose. In its default mode, the data flow is going from right to left. The very first element we have here is not related data flow, however. It is the bind menu. Here we can find different options and actions for this field. Now let's simulate the data flowing in this example. Our field is of floating point type. We get the click rate value in custom data from data scriptable object. We can preview it if we want to. Next, the data is converted from its source type to a floating point value. It can also be modified, for example multiplied by 2. Finally, the resulting value is written to our fire rate field. There are three bind modes: read, read-write, and write. The action, read or write, is from source path perspective, so in this case, the value is read from the path into target field. This is important to know, because the bind mode alone can change the data pipeline significantly. With this information, we are ready to bind some objects. First, we will bind one of the doors to the weight platform. Let's right-click and enable binding for desired opening field. Click to turn on binding and drag the weight platform object over the bind path. Here you see the menu of available bind sources. Navigate to physics slider component and select value. Now we have a binding. Let's test it right away. Clicking on Drop Cube button will release cubes, which contributes to the overall weight on the weight platform. You can see the door rotating based on platform's value. Great! Now we can bind the other door to a UI slider. We repeat the same steps. Enable binding for the field, turn it on, and drag the slider over the path field. We will use this UI slider over here. Drag it over, and navigate to slider component and select its value. Great! Another binding. Let's test it. Check it out, the slider is moving the door. Now let's make this label to show the value of the last slider. Again, the process is pretty similar with a slight difference. Instead of dragging the source, we select it from a list of last used sources directly in the menu. Now we have a converter from floating point to string. Let's set the format to 2 decimals. We need to make the text more user-friendly. For this, we will add a modifier, which formats the entire string. We need to test it, but we're not in play mode, and when changing the slider's value, nothing happens. There is, however, a way to make it work even in edit mode. In the bind menu, enable edit time. Now let's try again to change the slider's value. This time, we see the label updating. But we can do more. We can change the color of the label as well. The process this time is a bit more complex. Just follow along. Instead of binding from a dragged or recent source, we bind from a pinned object, the palette in this case. Now select one of the gradients. Enable edit time again. Here we see a gradient to color converter. Turn on value preview to see the source gradient. The converter has a slider for the gradient sample point. Changing it will change the color of the label. Bind this field to our slider's value. Now let's test it in play mode. Look how everything works together. The door opens, the label changes value and color. From here we will fast forward to bind the remaining objects. We will use this slider as source to bind the drop point height, using converters and modifiers. You can see how the slider is changing the height of the drop point. Next, we bind the related label to show the exact value of height of the drop point, again using converters and modifiers. We test it, and then we bind the last remaining slider with the drop cube's mass. We add a modifier to multiply the value by 5. Also, we bind as well the corresponding label to show the cube's mass value on UI, again with the usual suspects, converter and format string modifier. Then we test it and check that everything works as expected. The whole thing starts to take shape. The last thing that we will bind is the material of the dropped cube. The material will change depending on the cube's mass. The higher the mass, the more opaque the material. Here you see the floating window of the bind field. It can be triggered when there is not enough space in the inspector, or by holding Control key and clicking on the bind path. When testing it, you can see the binding in action. The cubes become more or less transparent depending on their mass. Alright, that's a wrap for this video. I hope you found it helpful and enjoyable. If you're looking for more details, don't forget to check out our documentation site. Thanks for watching, and take care.